Have you ever looked at someone trapped in a toxic relationship and wondered, why don't they just leave? Maybe you've even asked yourself that question. Why does someone stay when they are being criticized, manipulated, ignored, controlled, or emotionally drained? Why do they keep hoping that the person who hurts them will eventually become the person they desperately wanted them to be? The truth is far more complicated than weakness. People don't stay with narcissistic individuals because they are stupid. They don't stay because they enjoy suffering. And they certainly don't stay because they don't know something is wrong. Often, they stay because something inside the relationship is keeping them emotionally attached, even when their mind is screaming at them to escape. And there are two broad types of people who are especially likely to remain in these relationships. Understanding these two types can completely change the way you see narcissistic relationships. It can help you stop blaming the person who stays and start understanding the psychological forces that make leaving so difficult. The first type of person who often stays with a narcissistic individual is the person who becomes deeply attached to potential rather than reality. This person may not actually be happy with the relationship as it exists today, but they remain emotionally connected to the relationship they believe it could become. They remember the beginning, the attention, the affection, the compliments, the intense connection, and the feeling that they had finally found someone who truly understood them. When the relationship later becomes painful, confusing, or emotionally exhausting, they don't immediately let go of the person they first knew. Instead, they hold on to the hope that somehow that earlier version will return. They may tell themselves they're under stress right now, or maybe they are dealing with something emotionally. They may believe that if they communicate more clearly, become more patient, stop making mistakes, or love more deeply, everything will eventually improve. Every kind moment can feel like proof that change is possible. A sudden apology, a romantic gesture, or one peaceful weekend can make them believe that the relationship is finally turning around. But this is where the trap becomes powerful. They are no longer responding to the relationship they are actually living in. They are responding to the relationship they hope to have someday. Potential, however, is not the same as reality. You cannot build a healthy relationship around who someone might become. You have to pay attention to who they consistently choose to be. If the same patterns of manipulation, disrespect, blame, and emotional instability continue to repeat, occasional moments of kindness do not erase the larger pattern. The person who stays because of potential is often not weak. In many cases, they are deeply hopeful, loyal, compassionate, and capable of seeing the best in people. But hope becomes harmful when it keeps you attached to something that repeatedly hurts you. At some point, you have to stop asking, how can I bring back the person I fell in love with? And begin asking, what if the person I am seeing now is the person I need to believe? The second type of person who often stays with a narcissistic individual is someone who has gradually been conditioned to doubt themselves. In the beginning, this person may have been confident, independent, and completely capable of trusting their own judgment. They knew what they felt, they knew what they experienced, and they were comfortable making decisions for themselves. But over time, repeated manipulation can slowly weaken that confidence. The person begins hearing things like, that never happened, you're too sensitive, you're imagining things, or you're always the problem. When these messages are repeated again and again, they can start to change the way a person sees themselves. Eventually, they may begin questioning their own memories and emotions. They might think, maybe I really am overreacting, or maybe I misunderstood everything. Instead of trusting their instincts, they start looking to the narcissistic person for confirmation of what is real. This creates a dangerous emotional dependency because the very person who is creating the confusion becomes the person they rely on to explain it. This is one reason why telling someone, just leave, can be far more complicated than it sounds. Leaving requires a person to trust their own judgment, believe that their experiences are valid, and recognize that they deserve something healthier. But when someone has spent years being told that they are the problem, they may no longer have confidence in any of those things. They may be afraid that leaving will prove everyone was right about them being difficult or impossible to love. The healing process often begins when they slowly reconnect with their own reality. They begin recognizing patterns instead of isolated incidents. They start writing things down, talking to trusted people, setting small boundaries, and noticing how they feel when they are away from the relationship. Little by little, they realize that their emotions are not evidence of weakness, their memories are not automatically wrong, and their instincts deserve to be heard. The moment they begin trusting themselves again, the emotional grip of the relationship can start to weaken. There is another kind of person who may stay in a relationship with a narcissistic individual because they have an enormous capacity for empathy. This person often sees beyond someone's behavior. They notice the pain behind the anger, the insecurity behind the arrogance, and the fear behind the need for control. They may understand that the narcissistic person has their own wounds, difficult experiences, or unresolved emotional struggles. And because they can see those deeper layers, they begin making excuses for behavior that is hurting them. They might say they had a difficult childhood, or they don't really know how to express their feelings. They may believe that if they love this person enough, support them enough, or remain patient enough, they can somehow help them heal. Their compassion becomes a reason to stay, even when the relationship continues to damage their emotional well-being. The problem is that understanding someone's pain does not mean you have to accept their harmful behavior. You can recognize that someone has been hurt and still hold them responsible for the way they treat others. Their past may explain their behavior, but it does not automatically excuse it. Highly empathetic people can become trapped in the role of rescuer. Instead of asking, "Is this relationship healthy for me?" they constantly ask, "How can I help them?" They become focused on managing the other person's emotions, preventing arguments, calming them down, and avoiding anything that might trigger another emotional explosion. Slowly, their own needs begin disappearing from the relationship. They may stop expressing their opinions because they don't want conflict. They may apologize even when they did nothing wrong because peace feels more important than fairness. They may become emotionally exhausted from constantly trying to keep the relationship stable. But a healthy relationship cannot depend on one person continuously abandoning themselves to protect another person's feelings. Empathy is a beautiful quality, but it needs boundaries. You can understand someone's wounds without becoming responsible for healing them. You can care about someone's struggles without sacrificing your own mental and emotional well-being. And you can love someone deeply while still recognizing that their behavior is causing you harm. Sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do for yourself is to stop rescuing someone who refuses to take responsibility for their own healing. One of the most powerful reasons a person may remain in a narcissistic relationship is the cycle of unpredictable affection and rejection. In a healthy relationship, love and care are usually consistent. You may have disagreements, difficult days, or moments of frustration, but there is still a basic sense of emotional safety. With narcissistic patterns, however, affection can become unpredictable. One moment you may feel deeply loved, appreciated, and wanted, and the next you may be ignored, criticized, rejected, or treated as though you mean nothing. This emotional inconsistency can create a powerful attachment that is surprisingly difficult to break. When kindness appears only after periods of emotional pain, the relief can feel overwhelming. After being ignored for days, a simple loving message may feel incredibly meaningful. After a terrible argument, an apology or affectionate gesture may feel like proof that everything is finally changing. The person who stays may think, "This is the person I fell in love with. I knew they were still in there." That moment of relief can renew their hope and convince them to tolerate the next painful cycle. Over time, the relationship can begin to feel like an emotional roller coaster. There is tension, conflict, distance, and then suddenly connection. The person becomes focused on waiting for the next good moment. They may spend more energy anticipating when affection will return than evaluating whether the relationship is actually healthy. This is why someone can know intellectually that a relationship is hurting them while still feeling emotionally attached to it. They may not be addicted to the person themselves. They may be attached to the unpredictable possibility of receiving love and approval again. The uncertainty keeps them emotionally invested. Breaking this cycle requires learning to look beyond individual moments and recognize the larger pattern. One loving evening does not erase months of emotional neglect. One apology does not automatically represent lasting change. Promises are not the same as consistent behavior. Real change is demonstrated through accountability, stability, and repeated actions over time. When someone begins judging the relationship by its overall pattern rather than its occasional highs, they can finally see the difference between genuine emotional security and temporary relief from emotional pain. Sometimes a person stays in a narcissistic relationship not because they are emotionally attached to the person, but because they feel they have too much to lose by leaving. From the outside, it can be easy to assume that anyone in a painful relationship should simply walk away, but real life is rarely that simple. Relationships can become deeply complicated when there are children, shared finances, a home, family responsibilities, social pressure, or emotional dependence involved. For some people, leaving may mean losing financial stability, changing their entire lifestyle, or facing an uncertain future. There may also be fear involved. A person may worry about how the narcissistic individual will react if they try to leave. They may have experienced threats, intimidation, emotional retaliation, or intense attempts to pull them back into the relationship. Even when there is no physical danger, the emotional consequences can feel overwhelming. The person may fear being blamed, publicly humiliated, isolated from friends, or portrayed as the person who destroyed the relationship. Children can make the situation even more complicated. A parent may stay because they believe they are protecting their children from the instability that could come with separation. They may worry about custody, finances, or what will happen when they are no longer able to control the narcissistic person's access to the family. Financial dependence is another major factor. If one person controls the money, the other may not have the resources necessary to leave immediately. They may need time to find employment, save money, secure housing, or build a support system. This does not mean they are weak. It means they are facing real obstacles. This is why we should be careful about judging anyone who remains in a difficult relationship. Instead of asking, "Why don't you just leave?" it can be more compassionate to ask, "What is making it difficult for you to leave, and what support would help you feel more secure?" Sometimes leaving is not one dramatic decision. It is a gradual process of preparing, rebuilding confidence, creating support, and finding a safe path forward. The person may already be moving toward freedom, even if the outside world cannot see it yet. For many people, the turning point does not happen because of one terrible argument or one shocking event. Instead, it happens slowly when they finally begin to recognize the pattern that has been repeating throughout the relationship. For a long time, they may focus on individual incidents. They think about the argument that happened yesterday, the hurtful comment from last week, or the apology that came after another emotional conflict. They keep trying to solve each situation separately, believing that if they can just communicate better, explain themselves more clearly, or respond differently, the relationship might finally become peaceful. But eventually, something changes inside them. They stop looking at isolated moments and begin looking at the entire pattern. They start realizing that this isn't just a bad week. It isn't simply stress, poor communication, or a misunderstanding. The same cycle keeps returning. One person creates conflict while the other works desperately to restore peace. One person refuses accountability while the other constantly apologizes. One person changes the rules while the other keeps trying to meet impossible expectations. Once the pattern becomes visible, the person may finally understand that they have been trying to fix something that they did not create. This realization can be painful because it forces them to question the hope they have carried for so long. They may realize that the problem was never that they failed to explain their feelings properly. The problem was that the other person was unwilling to genuinely listen, take responsibility, or make lasting changes. At this point, the questions begin to change. Instead of asking, "How can I make this relationship work?" they start asking, "Why am I accepting this pattern?" Instead of constantly trying to change the other person, they begin thinking about what they can control in their own life. They may start setting boundaries, protecting their emotional energy, reconnecting with supportive people, and paying attention to their own needs again. The greatest shift often happens when they understand that they cannot force another person to become accountable, but they can decide what behavior they will continue to tolerate. Seeing the pattern does not instantly make everything easy, but it can become the moment when confusion begins turning into clarity. People often assume that someone finally leaves a narcissistic relationship when they stop loving the other person, but that is not always how it happens. Sometimes a person leaves while they still care deeply. They may still miss the person, remember the good moments, and even hope that one day the relationship could have become what they always wanted it to be. Leaving does not always mean that love suddenly disappears. Sometimes it means that a person finally understands that love alone cannot make an unhealthy relationship become healthy. The real turning point often happens when someone begins choosing themselves. After spending months or even years trying to understand the other person's emotions, excuses, wounds, and behavior, they finally begin asking a different question. What is happening to me in this relationship? They notice how exhausted they have become. They realize how much of their personality they have hidden, how many boundaries they have abandoned, and how often they have ignored their own needs just to keep someone else satisfied. They may finally understand that they have been waiting for an apology that never leads to change, believing promises that are repeatedly broken, and holding on to memories that no longer represent the reality of the relationship. Slowly, they begin choosing patterns over promises. They stop measuring the relationship by occasional moments of affection and start looking at the consistent behavior they experience every day. This person may still feel afraid. They may still question their decision. They may even have moments when they wonder if they should return, but something inside them has changed. They have begun to realize that peace is more valuable than temporary attention, and emotional safety is more important than occasional affection. Most importantly, they begin to understand that their worth does not depend on whether another person recognizes it. They no longer feel the need to convince someone to treat them with basic respect. They realize that they cannot control another person's choices, but they can control how much access that person has to their life. Eventually, the person who leaves understands that the goal is not simply to escape someone else's behavior. The deeper goal is to return to themselves, to rebuild their confidence, trust their instincts, reconnect with their identity, and create a life where love no longer requires them to abandon who they are. There are two broad types of people who often remain with narcissistic individuals. The first is the person who stays because they are attached to potential, the person who keeps believing that the loving version they once saw will eventually return. The second is the person who has gradually been conditioned to doubt themselves, the person who has lost confidence in their own perceptions and no longer trusts their ability to make the right decision. But beneath both patterns is something deeply human, the desire to be loved, the desire to be understood, the desire to believe that the person you invested your heart in will eventually give you the relationship you deserve. And that is why we must stop asking, why did they stay? Instead, we should ask, what happened to them while they were there? Because sometimes a person doesn't lose themselves all at once. They lose themselves slowly, one compromise at a time, one apology they didn't owe. One boundary they abandoned, one dream they gave up, one insult they accepted, one more chance they offered, until one day they realize they don't even recognize themselves anymore. And that realization can be painful, but it can also be the beginning of coming home to yourself. If you are someone who stayed, don't spend the rest of your life punishing yourself for the time you lost. Use that understanding to reclaim the time you still have. You are allowed to learn. You are allowed to change. You are allowed to leave. You are allowed to rebuild. And you are allowed to create a life where love doesn't require you to abandon yourself, because the goal isn't simply to get away from a narcissistic person. The deeper goal is to return to yourself. To trust your instincts again, to hear your own voice again, to understand your worth again, and to finally realize that the healthiest relationship you can build after narcissistic abuse may begin with the relationship you have with yourself. The moment you stop asking, how do I make them love me? And start asking, why did I ever believe I had to earn the right to be treated with respect? That is the moment everything begins to change.